Well, until we do something to actually change the structure to give ourselves governing authority in our own communities, chances are projects like Northern Pass, it's not the last one to come through, there's going to be more. And so the idea is, how do we make structural change to actually give our communities decision-making authority so we don't have to do this every time something comes through that we don't want.
So, Attorney Linzey, it's not as simple as taking a piece of paper and filing it as an ordinance, is it?
No, it's actually the first step of a series of steps that leads to some kind of constitutional change to recognize the right of the community to make decisions in the name of sustainability, to make sure that things like Northern Pass don't come in.
So the Democracy School teaches people how to take back democracy for their communities. I'm going to turn it over now to Gail Darrell.
The only way to gain democratic control was to seize the opportunity to assert their local governing rights, regardless of what the regulatory system said about that being legal or within their jurisdiction.
Thanks, Gail. And so we hung out our shingle back in 1995, and as you can imagine, when you say free legal services, that people line up around the block and our phones start ringing off the hook. And after about 12 months or so, after about a year, we were servicing 300 community organizations across the state of Pennsylvania, which is where we began our work. And most of that work was with organizations who were facing toxic waste incinerators or landfills, or uses in corporate projects that they didn't particularly want, like Synagro hauling sludge from Philadelphia to dump in rural communities, because guess what? Sludge doesn't get dumped on the multi-million-dollar homes in suburban Philadelphia. It gets dumped in the rural part of Pennsylvania. And so in assisting those community groups, we ran into a situation kind of akin to Groundhog Day. I'm not sure how many people have seen the movie Groundhog Day. For those who haven't, Bill Murray wakes up every morning and he lives the same day over and over and over again. No matter how hard he tries to live a different day, he gets up and he lives the same day over and over again. Our Groundhog Day back at the office began with community organizations who would call us on the phone. And they would call us and they would say, our community is slated to get a 15,000 head hog factory farm in the middle of it. And our vision for sustainable agriculture or sustainable community where we live means not having a 15,000 head hog factory farm in the middle of our community. And they would say to me, we want to say no to it. We just don't want it. We just don't want it here. We want to say no to it. And so we would have to patiently explain to these folks, and this was the Groundhog Day piece, as conventional, traditional environmental lawyers, who, keep in mind, are taught back in law school that the United States has the best environmental laws in the world. And the reason why things are falling apart out there, and the planet is disintegrating and everything else, is because we don't have enough people enforcing the laws. And that's what you're taught in law school. And so with these folks on the phone, we would have to explain to them. We would say to them, well, we're sorry, under conventional environmental law, you don't have the power to say no within your own community. Because as it's been law for the past 120 years in the United States, and you can ask the corporate lawyers, you can ask the environmental lawyers, it doesn't matter who you ask, it's well-settled black letter law, as they say in the legal profession, that communities are prohibited from banning legal uses. Right? I'm going to say it again, because it always comes as a shock to a lot of folks. It came as a shock to me back in the late 1990s. But the rule is this: communities are prohibited from banning legal uses, L-E-G-A-L, legal uses in their community. What's a legal use? You name it, it's pretty much a legal use. Big box stores, low-level radioactive waste sites, pork production in the United States have been defined as legal use. If the state has a regulatory program, a permit's issued for something, or it needs some kind of agency decision-making to say yes or no on it, it's a legal use. Which means in the United States, communities are prohibited from banning legal uses. And sometimes we give our talks and we say, well, Mr. Linzey, that's not true. We have zoning and we have land use ordinances. And of course, those say no to certain uses. Well, actually they don't. What they do is they separate out incompatible land uses from each other, residential from commercial, commercial from industrial. If you attempt to use a zoning ordinance to ban a use in all parts of the municipality, in other words, to ban the legal use in all parts of the municipality, the next thing that happens to you is a lawsuit by the corporation that's affected by the ban, contending that you've violated the corporation's constitutional rights. Okay, I'm going to get to that in a couple minutes because that's a big piece of what we do. So going back to this phone call coming in, the community group would say, we want you to help us stop this thing. We want to say no to it. We would say, well, unfortunately, under the status of law that we have, under the structure of law we have, we can't say no to it or help you say no to it outright. But what we can do is help you appeal the permit that's been issued for that particular use. And Gail took you through, in essence, what was our learning curve for about 5 years, which was we would do what all good environmental lawyers do, which was we would take the corporate permit application, which was, 500, 600 pages long, and we would compare it to the regulations that were adopted at the state level. And we would compare the two after the agency had issued the permit, because we were appealing the permit's issuance. And we would find what was missing in the permit application submitted by the corporation. So let's just be very practical. For toxic waste incinerators in Pennsylvania, you have to post a $500,000 bond to pay for the roads that are used in and out from the incinerator. Well, we would have some corporations that would put a $250,000 bond with their application forward. Or the regulations would require the president of the company to sign the application. And lo and behold, we would find that the secretary of the corporation had signed it, but not the president. Or there needed to be a water study, and there was no water study with the application. And so we would go in on behalf of the community group, riding the white horse with the white hat, and we would argue to the judge, that the agency never should have issued the permit because it's missing certain things. It's deficient. It doesn't qualify under the regulations that are in place to govern the issuance of that particular permit. And therefore, Your Honor, under section little 2, little c, little d, little Roman numeral 2, little I, little 2, little c, little I, it shouldn't have issued. The agency made a mistake. They made an error. You need to overturn it and throw the permit out. And by and large, most of the times that we were in court with these communities, we would win. And it wasn't because we had a silver tongue or anything. It's just that 90% of all the permits that are issued never get challenged because nobody can afford to challenge them from the community. And so sometimes in life, showing up is half the battle. And so we would go in and do this work with the judge, and the judge would issue a decision. We had a win-loss record of something like 135-7, in representing these community groups. Permit would get tossed. What would happen next? Well, the folks from the community group that had hired us in the first place, they would have a victory party. And we would go back to their house, and we would have some snacks, and we'd have some beer, and we'd all pat ourselves on the back, and the community group would say, the system worked, right? We found we had a problem here in our community. We found the right lawyer. Lawyer made the right arguments. The judge was reasonable. He listened to what we had to say. He decided on our side, and now we're not going to get the toxic waste incinerator. We're not going to get landfill. We're not going to get sludge. We're not going to get the factory farm, whatever it was, whatever the single issue was. And we would go home from the victory party, feeling pretty good about ourselves and everything else. What would happen 6 weeks later? Corporation would come back. And this time the corporate lawyers would use our material, the gaps, omissions, deficiencies that we had found in the permit application, and would come back and fill it, right? Submit a new water study or submit this or that. And in fact, I had some of the corporate lawyers who I got to know quite well come over to me and thank us for helping them find the gaps and omissions and deficiencies so they could put together better permit applications to submit through for the permit process. Now, I'm of course shortening most of this down because we have a project in Pennsylvania that's been fought for 14 years through 8 different cycles of this thing. Because sometimes a corporation comes back, they don't fill it in correctly, and then you appeal them again, and you go through the cycle again. It's like a hamster running endlessly on a wheel going through this process. And the reason why it's a hamster wheel process is because the regulations that are ostensibly supposed to regulate these types of projects are written by the very corporations that they're supposed to be regulated, right? Which means that it's a definition of insanity in the United States, which is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result the next time. Because if you think that the corporate boys have written the regulatory scheme to actually allow you to have any semblance of democracy whatsoever at the community level to say no to their projects that they wrote the regulatory scheme to allow in your community, we're the crazy ones. And we're actually operating under a script that's been written by someone else that controls us and makes our activism predictable in our communities. And we wonder why things are getting worse out there. And we wonder why things are getting worse in our communities when we don't seem to even make the decisions that matter about what our community looks like in 20, 40, or 60 years. Okay? So after the victory party, the corporation would come back, put a new permit application in. the community would come back to us and they'd say, Mr. Linzey, we need you to do that jujitsu that you did the first time around to get the permit application out, the permit issuance out. And we would look back at them and we would say, we're sorry, there's nothing we can do for you anymore because we have no levers anymore. The corporation has filled in all those gaps and deficiencies that we had found. There's nothing left for us to do. And so we got pretty discouraged. We got even more discouraged when somebody back in the late 1990s said two things to us. Number one, we thought at least we were costing the corporations money because if you show up, they have to hire somebody to show up to oppose you, and therefore they have to expend money to do that. It was then that we learned that the monies that they spend on these permit objection hearings and the permit process is tax deductible. It's tax deductible as a reasonable and necessary business expense under the federal tax code. Right? You can write it off. And the second thing someone said to me, who was much smarter than I was back in the 1990s, she said something which I said in other words, which is the only thing that regulations regulate is us. Because they make us predictable as to how we oppose certain projects when they come in. Right? It's actually all scripted out by the corporate boys who are in the legislature, who write the regulatory structures to give us a certain role to play, and by God, we play it very well. It's been our history of activism in the United States for the past 40 years in this country. And it's why things keep getting worse, right? And it's why community decision-making continues to be degraded. So what did we do? Well, we decided to close our office back in the late 1990s. We said, we're not going to do this anymore. We were created to do something much different than to help corporations build better permit applications, which is in essence where we found ourselves ending up. And it was at that point in time that we started getting phone calls into our office from a constituency that we were not set up to assist, which was rural municipal governments in the state of Pennsylvania, mostly in the rural area, known as the rural T. And just to give you an idea of Pennsylvania really quick, for folks that haven't been there, we have a rural T, which is very low populated, very rural, very conservative. If you run for office in Pennsylvania, statewide office, you run for governor, and you win Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, you don't even need to set foot in the other 62 counties in the middle part of the state because they're so rural, nobody cares about them from a political perspective. And they get crapped on quite often. And it's where all the stuff goes. It's where all the PCB dredge gets dumped, it's where all the sludge goes, it's where the factory farms get set up, you name it, it's where it happens, is in that rural part of the state of Pennsylvania. We were getting phone calls because a small number of agribusiness corporations had decided to set up shop in rural Pennsylvania to put in 10,000, 15,000 head hog factory farms, these vertically integrated concentrated animal feeding operations. Up until that point, about 100 communities in that stretch, that rural area, had put in ordinances that very stringently regulated liquid manure being disposed of. I won't get into detail, especially because we're eating lunch, but the liquid manure from the factory farms has to be disposed of somewhere, usually it goes onto land. These communities said, we don't want these intensive ag facilities there because we understand they compete against our family farmers, there's economic, environmental damage, everything else. We're going to pass very strict regulatory laws that make it prohibitively expensive to apply liquid manure to the ground. So in other words, they were bans. They were what we call in the legal industry de facto bans, making it so expensive to do a certain activity that it becomes prohibitive to do so there. The agribusiness corporations, when they came into the rural part of Pennsylvania, when they came into the rural part of the state, said to themselves, we can't do business in those municipalities if those really stringent regulatory ordinances are there. And so what did they do? Well, they went to the legislature and they drafted a bill called the Nutrient Management Act. And what the Nutrient Management Act do? Well, it said if you wanted to put in one of these vertically integrated big CAFO operations, that you just had to file a plan with the state. You just had to file a plan to say this is how we're going to do it with the state. So it's a planning law. Meanwhile, at 2 in the morning, which is when our legislature in Pennsylvania at least does their best work, is at 2 in the morning, they slid a rider in that preempted all 100 ordinances from being enforced. So like that, preempted, overrode, prevented them from being enforced, nullified them across the state. As the state said, hey, we got this law now, you localities, you don't need to worry about the liquid manure anymore. we've got this planning law at the state level, and so there's no need for those ordinances, little more, you happy little people down there. You don't need them anymore, and so we're going to preempt them from being there anymore. And so they nullified them overnight. We were getting calls from municipal officials because, simply put, they were against a rock and a hard place. Their residents were screaming at them to do something. You know, you have one of these operations move in a quarter of a mile from your house, you lose 60% of your property value. You got water pollution, odor pollution, the economic damage. We've lost 300,000 farmers over the past 8 years in the United States. We always say lost, like we can't find them, but we all know where they went, which is out of business. And so the question for the folks in these rural areas was they were getting screamed at by their residents to do something. Their lawyers, their municipal lawyers, were saying you can't do anything. The elected officials, we call them supervisors, the township supervisors in Pennsylvania, they looked at the lawyer and said, what do you mean we can't do anything? The agribusiness industry came in, they wrote this law, the legislature passed it, and now you're telling us that because the intent of that law was actually to nullify our ordinances, that there's nothing we can do here at the municipal level. And the lawyer said, yep, that's right, there's nothing you can do because state overrides the local, we all know that, we've learned it since kindergarten, it's in our brains, and there's nothing you can do about it here in the local level. And so they began to call us. And what was funny to us was, at about that time, it may have been something in the water. I don't know, something was happening. And it continues to happen in the United States because I think more and more people are figuring out what the system actually looks like, what the structure in this country actually looks like. And they're starting to ask questions about whether that's actually democracy or not, when people at local levels can't even say yes or no to certain things coming in. And so the calls that came into our office changed. And one of the reasons was we still had an office because we hadn't shut down yet. And the calls to the office were, somebody would call and say, we have this 15,000 head hog factory farm coming in, and we would start our little chant that we would do, which is, well, you can't say no to it, you can appeal the permit, do those types of things. And the people on the other end of the line started asking us really tough questions that we didn't know how to answer. So they started saying, why? Why can't we say no? Why can't we just pass a blanket ordinance that says no factory farms? If we don't want factory farms, let's define what they are, and then let's say no to them. Because we, as a community, why don't we have the power to do that, right? And we said, well, it's because if you try to do that, then the corporations affected by it are going to come in and sue you. And they're going to sue you because they have constitutional rights, right? And the people on the other end of the phone would say, well, what's that? And we would say, well, it's because corporations are persons in this country. They have the full Bill of Rights protections that you or I have, which means that if their property is taken without just compensation, a la the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, corporations are treated as persons, which means they can sue the municipality for takings of their property, along with a slew of other rights under the Bill of Rights as well. And to make it even worse, in this country, the civil rights laws that were passed after the Civil War to protect newly freed slaves in their right to vote has now been applied to corporations, to allow corporations to sue municipalities not only to overturn ordinances, but to sue municipalities for something called future lost profits in response to the violation of the corporation's constitutional and civil rights within the municipality. So we would say to this to the communities, we would say, well, the corporations have constitutional rights in the United States, and the communities would say, why? And we would say, well, it's because the Constitution has been interpreted that way by the courts. And they would say, why? And we would say, well, it's because the U.S. Constitution is kind of favorable towards property and commerce. It's like a structural thing in the U.S. constitutional text. It puts certain values above others. And the community would say, why? What's that? And we'd say, well, it's because the Constitution was written by folks that were kind of schooled in this thing called English common law, right? And English common law was like the worst of the worst stuff. It was when England was a colonizing power, and they used the law to legalize the violence and the terror that had to go into actual colonizing other places, right? And they would say, well, why? We'd say, we have no idea. Why don't you stop asking us why? And so communities were starting to try to grapple with this stuff about what's the structural stuff with this? Why is it that we're always accepting or forced to accept these types of things coming in? And we began to work with a small number of very rural, most rural that you can think of, communities in south central Pennsylvania. The biggest one was probably 750 people, just to show you how small these places were. And we started working with them to do legislative work. We started drafting ordinances with them. And the first ordinance that was passed was back in 1999, and it banned corporate farming within municipalities in south central Pennsylvania. It banned factory farms, in essence, by saying that corporations, certain corporations, not family corporations, but the big corporations, couldn't come into the municipality to actually open up these factory farm facilities. And what was amazing to me was that once one community did it, the structure counts on us for being very obedient. That's what the structure counts on us for. Once we start crossing the lines, there are various things that punish us when we go outside of what we call the box of allowable activism. We've been caught in a box where we're told that there are certain things that are allowable for us to do. We can go to the legislature. That's being good. You can go to the legislature and you can talk to your legislators. That's being good. You can send letters to you. That's also good. You can work in the regulatory stuff like zoning and land use. That's also good. You're being good boys and girls when you do that. But when you look at all the remedies that you're supposed to have under the system, zoning and land use and some of the regulatory crumbs that we've been allowed to have in our municipality, and you say to yourself, that's not going to get us where we need to go. That's not going to deliver to us what we need to do within this community. And you start moving outside. We call it coloring outside the lines. You start going outside. There are a variety of different tools that are used to punish you. We're like Pavlov's dog in some ways, in that we've been trained in many places since kindergarten to believe that for every damage to us there must be a remedy because we live in a democracy. But as it turns out, we're actually kept within a relatively small box of activism where we're allowed to do certain things but not do others. And it's when you cross outside the box that things get very interesting. Because it's our contention that the only way real change has ever occurred in this country is when people have dared to step outside the box. Right? That's what the abolitionists did, that's what the suffragists did, that's what movements do, is move outside the box. Anyway, in Pennsylvania, when one community decided to move outside the box, what happened was other communities said to themselves, it's not so scary to move outside the box, right? Especially when you have no other options outside the box, right? You're kept in a certain area and you're told that the stuff outside the box that may make a real difference is for other people. It's for the state government, it's for the federal government, it's for the experts, it's for the lawyers, it's for the professors, it's for the law professors, it's all for those people. But that it's not for you in your own communities because you're not experts on anything. And there's a reason why you don't have lawmaking authority in your own community to do anything real. It's because you don't know what you're doing. Right? I've heard that over and over and over again in different places. Anyway, in Pennsylvania, one place did it. 700 people. They stood up and they said, no more. We're not going to do this anymore. Right? And once one stood up, then two stood up. Then 5, then 10, then 15. Then 80, then 100, then 110, across the state of Pennsylvania. And what that did was not only say to people, it's okay to stand up and do things outside the box, because the box has been built for you by people that have no interest in watching you move outside the box. But it started to do something else, which was start to change a culture of allowable activism, and also envisioning what it would look like for those folks, those communities, they become a revolt of sorts that pushes upwards to change state structures of law and also further upwards to change even federal structures of law. Because we think that's the only way it happens in the United States. Now in Pennsylvania, the two big issues for 110 communities to pass ordinances were factory farms and the land application of sludge. A relatively small number of corporations in the United States, 6 to be exact, control 70% of pork production in this country. 6 corporations control 80% of chicken production. 1 corporation controls 90% of cheese production. It's Kraft. Controls 90% of cheese production. And so you have a corporatization of agriculture that's occurred. On the sludge issue, we're not going to talk much about sludge, we're trying to keep this fairly short, but the sludge stuff that the industry now calls biosolids, that they ship into places to dump on land. There are 3 corporations that control 70% of the sludge hauling business. One of the biggest is Synagro, which Hydropress. You guys have a lot of experience with some of these corporations here in New Hampshire. But all to say, what we saw in 2000 to 2004 was actually an uprising of sorts in the state of Pennsylvania about people who were unwilling to remain subordinate in a system that seemed to give corporations coming in more rights than the majorities who lived in the communities in which the corporation was trying to do business, right? And so what happened next? Well, what happened next was the thing spread. Spread to New Hampshire, spread to Maine, through folks like Gale, who were trying to stop large-scale corporate water withdrawals from occurring within their communities. Like Shapley, Maine, trying to stop Nestle Corporation from coming in, and USA Springs Corporation, which had targeted Nottingham, New Hampshire, for withdrawing water. And these communities said to themselves, well, wait a minute, we're not dealing with sludge or factory farms, but it doesn't seem to matter what the issue is. It doesn't seem to matter what the issue is, because a community trying to do something different runs up against the same structural hurdles, right? Whether they be corporate rights or some of the other stuff we're going to talk about in a minute, that communities are stuck within that structure. And that's a structure that needs to change. So it doesn't matter what the issue is. The issue is just a placeholder almost, because the issue is not about factory farms, it's about democracy. It's not about fracking, for natural gas, which is a big thing in the Northeast now. It's about democracy, right? It's not about energy transmission lines. It's about democracy. It's about local control. It's about who decides. It's about who makes the decision where you live. Should it be the people that live there, or should it be someone from 2,000 miles away, or a corporate board of directors? Who should it be? And it seems that we've lost some idea of what democracy is. I don't know about you guys, but back in kindergarten I was taught democracy was about majorities making decisions, right? Consent to the governed and majority rule. But it seems at this point we have a special structure of law that allows a corporate minority to override a community majority. And that lawmaking authority isn't even given to community majorities at this point in municipalities and in communities. The work spread other places. People started hearing this stuff and said, hey, we need that here. So to Maryland, which passed one of the first ordinances that we worked with them on last year, to Wales, New York, who are dealing with fracking issues, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the largest municipality in the United States, has worked with us to ban hydrofracking in the city of Pittsburgh, in the municipality, to ban natural gas extraction within the city of Pittsburgh, unanimously by the city council there. And so what's starting to happen across the United States, I think, is a revolt of sorts. It's a revolt against the subordinate nature that our communities have been put into, and an idea, semblance of an idea about what it's going to take to change that. And it doesn't matter what the issues are, like I said a minute ago, because it's the structure itself that stops us from actually coloring outside those lines usually, because we're punished if we move outside those lines. So let's talk about some of those doctrines. There are, in essence, 4 of them. One is corporate constitutional rights. I'm going to draw this up. Didn't think we'd be using it. So in the U.S., we're caught in this box. We call it shorthand, and we teach it in democracy school this way. It's the allowable activism box. When folks get active in their communities, they're actually channeled in some ways down to what we call allowable remedies. So sometimes a community will pick up the phone and call a state agency, and they'll say, what can we do about this? The state agency will say, I'm so glad you called, because you can hire a lawyer and get involved in the permit process. And so, you know the diagram, which we weren't going to show up today, but it's the triangle diagram, which is communities when they pop up, they tend to get driven down a triangle. And using Pennsylvania as an example, we have the state nutrient management plan here, which allows communities only to talk about manure and how much manure gets applied to land. And so the community group arises, folks around a kitchen table, and they say we have a problem. And the first thing they do, because they haven't been active before, they don't know the landscape, is they make a phone call to the state. And they say, well, this is a state issue, an agency issue. They call it something like the Department of Environmental Protection. Pennsylvania, that's what the state environmental agency is called. People refer to it as the Department of Everything Permitted. At this point. And so they pick up the phone, they call them, and like I said, the agency guy says, so have you called? We were waiting for your call. We have the red phone here, which we're waiting for your call. They said, so happy you called. Just happens we're doing a permit evaluation now. And to get involved with that, all you need to do is hire a lawyer and actually help us through the permit process, to give us your input as a stakeholder. That's the word that they like to use. Or the community turns to the corporation, because the corporation's in their community giving presentations, stuff like that, and they talk to the corporate representative, and they say, hey, we're active, we want to get involved in this, and the corporate representative says, oh, we're so happy you're here, because we're going through this permit process, and we want your input, we want your take, we want your stakeholder presence in this process. And so what you need to do is hire a lawyer, because of course you guys aren't experts, but hire a lawyer to help you understand this permit process. And they drive communities down to what we call a regulatory point. And it's this regulatory point which is similar to how cattle are run down the chute in the processing plant, and then they get the bulb shot through their heads, because this has been scripted for you. The whole process has been scripted for you. This point especially, which is to not give you a remedy that you're seeking, but instead channel you down to that point. And what's worse than the state of the corporations doing, which we might expect because they have vested interest to do so, on the other side is us. For 5 years, this is what the Legal Defense Fund did, which was we channeled people just as effectively down into that process. Because we said, well, you know, we're glad you called, and you can't say no to it, but you can appeal the permit, and you can go right into this process. And so when I say us, most of the big environmental groups, this is what they do. This is what they've made a career out of. This is how they raise money. I mean, they are in this process, and they will continue to send you, if they haven't already, down to this regulatory point. They'll urge you to color inside the lines, because it's what they know. They don't set foot outside those lines for the most part. When you do set foot outside the lines and actually attempt to say no to something coming in, so the community has decided something is harmful and dangerous, we don't want it. It's like the fracking stuff now in the Northeast has become, which is now moving out to other places, and you decide to move outside of the script you've been given and actually do something different. What happens? Well, the structure of law comes down on you, because the structure of law is written to prevent you from moving outside the box, right? And this gets back to the basic undemocratic nature of the structure we live in. But one of the things that's used is something called preemption. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of preemption. It's either state preemption or federal preemption. It's this concept that we've also learned since kindergarten, that the federal trumps the state trumps the local. We hardly ever think about it anymore. That preemption is almost the ultimate anti-democratic device, because it pulls decision-making further and further away from the community affected by the decision, and pulls it up to fewer and fewer hands further away from where the activity is having an impact. That's what preemption is about. Then you have something called Dillon's rule. I'm covering this really fast so we can do some more question-answer part of this. But what's Dillon's rule? Well, Dillon was a railroad lawyer, and Dillon's job was to keep municipal governments from interfering with the railroad corporations as they drove their rail lines west. Why does that matter? Well, Dillon came up with a rule in which he said that the relationship between the municipality, which is your community, right? Municipality is your community, and the corporation that wants to use the community for something. The relationship between the municipality and the state is one of a parent to a child. The parent being the state, the child being the municipality. And the only powers that the municipality has are the powers explicitly given to it by the state, right? And the reason why that's important is because if your community wants to ban something or move outside this box, chances are the state has not given you the explicit authority to do it, which means Dillon's rule kicks in to try to prevent you from doing it. It's almost the flip side of preemption. Preemption is the state saying you can't, and Dillon's rule is saying that the municipality is prevented from doing something it doesn't have the explicit authority to do. And finally down here is something called corporate constitutional rights, which we covered briefly. This isn't just personhood rights, i.e. corporations are persons under the law, but it's also stuff like the Commerce Clause. And this intimately affects you folks. Because in the U.S. Constitution, corporations have what are called Commerce Clause powers. Under the Commerce Clause in the United States Constitution, it says Congress and the federal government will be the explicit arbiter of all things commerce. So all commerce rules that deal with interstate commerce, stuff crossing state lines. And the reason why that's important is because once you denote something as commerce, and almost everything has been denoted as commerce, double-hauled trucks, again, low-level radioactive waste sites, electrical transmission lines that wheel electricity between states or different places, and pork production, basically anything you can think of as commerce. Once you get it denoted as commerce, and garbage has been denoted as commerce as well in the United States, so that garbage, interstate transportation of garbage is commerce under the U.S. law. And so, under this Commerce Clause, anything can be overturned at the local or state level that regulates interstate commerce because it's a congressional exclusive authority thing. That's what the Commerce Clause is. And the final piece of this, which is hard to wrap our brains around, but we have to at some point, is that ecosystems and nature, what we would think of as natural systems, are treated as property under our system of law. We own it. And so the more property you can own under the system of law, the more ecosystems you can destroy under the system of law. Because ecosystems in nature are treated as property. We're so used to seeing them as property, it's hard to think of them as anything else. But it's another doctrine that allows anybody that holds a deed for like a 10-acre piece of land to have the legal authority to destroy the nature and ecosystems that are on that 10-acre piece of land. That's how the system is structured in the United States. Why does all this matter, and why have we taken precious time to outline it on the board? Well, it matters because all of those doctrines are privately enforceable, which means that it's not the state that comes in to your municipality and says to your municipality, you're violating the Commerce Clause. It's the corporation that comes in using those claims. So just to be very practical, you're a community in northeastern part of let's say you're in Pennsylvania, you pass an anti-fracking law that bans fracking within the community. The next thing you're looking at is the fracking corporation enforcing these doctrines against you, right? So the corporation comes in and says, well, you can't ban fracking because the state allows it. The state regulates it, which means the state is permitting or legalizing or allowing it to occur. And therefore your ban runs counter to the preemption or counter to state law that deals with fracking issues. On Dillon's rule, the corporation will come in and count 2 will be your municipality lacks the authority to pass the ordinance that you're trying to pass because it lacks the authority to do anything the state has not explicitly authorized it to do. The corporate constitutional rights stuff is fascinating because the corporation will come in and say you violated the corporation's 5th Amendment rights, or you violated the corporation's 14th Amendment rights, or you violated the corporation's 4th Amendment rights, or you violated the Commerce Clause because you're attempting to regulate something that is exclusively congressional or federal jurisdiction, and therefore you violated the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. This doesn't come so much into play unless you do something in the ordinance that changes the status of ecosystems in nature from being property into being something else, which about 36 municipalities in the United States have done so far over the past 7 to 10 years. So all to say, the system is built to keep you here. The only reason why communities move outside the box, they move outside this box of allowable activism, is because they have to. That's the only reason. Nobody chooses to do something that's going to get them punished. Nobody says on Wednesday, I'm going to take on the largest energy corporation in the United States. Don't say that. But we're coming to a time when government itself is becoming corporatized. Government itself is becoming corporatized. We use the phrase in our democracy schools, a corporate state, where there's no difference between the way the state government operates and what the corporations want. And so the question is, do we come? Maybe we're there, maybe we're not, I don't know. But is there a time when this box becomes so small, it's been shrinking for the last 50 years, but becomes so small that what we want in our communities, we can't even get a semblance of it within the box of allowable activism, and we have to move outside of it. Which of course raises the question, which is where I'm going to finish up the talking for a while, but it raises the question of, so what? Right? In fact, we put up a big sheet in the democracy school and it says, so what on it, right? What does all this mean? Where is it headed? Well, it can't just be one isolated municipality that tries to do something, because then you have a bullseye on your back. And it's easy for the corporation to dismantle you when it's just one place. And people say, well, okay, so there's more than one place. What if you get 100 or 110 like the state of Pennsylvania? Well, folks in Pennsylvania from those municipalities are now talking about what a state constitutional convention might be. To actually drive a right to local self-government into the constitutional structure of the state. and eventually push higher up to change some of the other structures of the state. Which means that passing an ordinance is just the first step. We tend to think of it as, oh, it's a solution, we want to put a solution in place. There is no solution under this structure of law, because the doctrines are there to punish you no matter what you do. And so the solution or the key is to do the local lawmaking in a way that places the municipality in the best defensible position possible, while waiting and cultivating other places to move. New Hampshire is not as big as Pennsylvania. In New Hampshire, if you had 50 towns moving on something, no matter what the issue is, could be the transmission lines, could be food issues, could be water issues, doesn't matter what the issue is. But if you get a critical mass of communities moving to change the structural stuff, which they all have in common, no matter what the issue is, you will eventually have the power to remake this place. Because guess what? It may be Northern Pass this year. It's going to be something else next year. And it's going to be something else 5 years from now, and something else 10 years from now. In Colorado, the corporations are now digging up dirt to burn, right, as an energy source. Just to tell you what's happening out there. The quest for energy, the quest for everything, because we're on a rapidly diminishing place here, is to take everything from you that you care about at this point. That's the path for the next 50 years, unless people stand up and start saying no. And right now that's happening in small pockets, but it's not happening in a way that's going to shift it up, because you need 10,000 communities who say we're not going to live under the system of law anymore. And that's why we harken back to the people's movements of the past, because they didn't color inside the lines. The only reason women got the right to vote through the suffragist movement, which lasted 90 years, the organized suffragist movement, 90 years. The reason why the abolitionists drove in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, because they colored outside the lines. They started doing a different kind of activism, because the stuff in that box is not going to do, pardon my French, shit for anything. You know, it may move the sight line slightly, the path. And there are other regulatory stuff, like in Pennsylvania, they're zoning the drill pads on the surface for the fracking operations. But the corporations now have horizontal drills. And so even if you zone residential and conservation out for fracking, they can come down and over up to 1.5 miles and actually get the gas deposits out of those residential and conservation areas, because your zoning laws only are for surface use, not for underground. And so people are saying, well, we have zoning, we have planning stuff. Well, bullshit, you don't have that, because they can reach anything that they want, so let's not pretend that that's local control. You now have earthquakes happening in Ohio around fracking operations. You have water polluted in different places. EPA just came out and said, yes, it can pollute water, and has in Wyoming, in frack spots. And so, you know, it's kind of like the X-Files, you know, if anybody's ever watched them, trust no one. Because the corporate stuff is so heavy and so everywhere that it's so easy to get into that false sense of security, to say somebody's going to take care of me. But guess what? It's frightening, but there's nobody that's taking care of you. There's nobody. And you're treated as a little pawn moving around the board. And the corporate boys, they have almost unlimited resources. And they're on the phone every week talking about this stuff. I've been lucky or unlucky enough to be on the phone on some of those calls with the corporate council as they discuss this stuff. And I've been at the conferences, one of the only public interest folks invited to some of these conferences. They think you're funny, because they understand what they've built over the past 150 years. They understand how it's stitched together, and they laugh at it. They laugh at it. And they're on the phone comparing notes every week. You know, something passes in one part of the country, they rush to the state legislature in the other part of the country to stitch it, to patch it up. Right? They're always learning, and they're always organized. And they have unlimited resources. And so the question is, what are you going to do? Right? What are you going to do tomorrow? What have you been doing? Which is quite a bit. To move a different structure forward. And from the lessons that we've learned over the past 15 years in coming head to head with some of the largest agribusiness, development, waste management corporations on the planet, we've learned a lot about what their script looks like. And we've gotten fairly good at writing our own script, which then we force them to follow in some ways. And so the question is whether we have stuff that can help you out as you move forward. But all to say, with the caveat that I raised, which is this is a long-term thing, right? It's not about a patch. It's actually about changing the way the structure operates. And the structure is all about the endless production of more. And the law protects that value, right? That's the insane, crazy, horrific piece of looking at the U.S. system. That's how it's set up. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that it's set up that way. When the folks wrote it, they looked out on a country of almost endless natural resources, and they said to themselves, we only become a great country if we figure out how to use them. And we use them the quickest way possible, and we use them the most efficient way possible. And they wrote a plan of governance that does that. And it's done it very well over the past 150 years. The question is, does it still work today? If we think it does, then we should all go home, because we're all fine. But if it's not working, and we see a need to turn it around, then it's going to take some outside-the-box thinking and outside-the-box municipalities moving forward to actually threaten the state's power. Because it's not just the corporations, it's the state that enables the corporation to do what it does. Right? Corporations are chartered by the state, they're given these powers by the state, they are state creations in many ways. And so the problem is not just defeating a corporation, it's about changing the structure of law that allows the corporation to do what it does in the first place. And that may sound like a huge hurdle or a huge mountain, but there are other folks in the United States who are working parallel with you at this point.
How did the system work in Pittsburgh where they banned the fracking?
It was fascinating to go through the Pittsburgh experience because, as Gail says, there are 130 other communities besides Pittsburgh that have passed similar structures of law into place. Pittsburgh was just the largest, so people tend to see it first, but they followed the footsteps of these other places. And in Pittsburgh, the Maine Natural Gas Association threatened to sue the city of Pittsburgh 48 hours before the ordinance was passed, which made it all the more amazing that the city council voted unanimously to put it into place. So here they were challenging the structure of law, voting unanimously to put it in place. 24 hours after the law was passed, the Gas Association backed off and said, we're not going to sue the city. And we think that they did it. We've been in those situations before. Of the 130 that have passed, 140 that have passed in the United States, only 3 have been challenged of those 140. Most of the time it's because the corporation can go someplace else. So they move out of the municipality because of that structure of law, and they go someplace else. Or they understand that we're trying to get them into a rights battle. It's different than a corporation coming in and saying, let's argue over parts per million, or talk about preemption and the regulatory stuff and how it interacts. It's about rights versus rights, and it's about how these ordinances are constructed. What Pittsburgh did was not just ban fracking. They also passed a local Bill of Rights within the city to expand out state and federal constitutional protections to provide new civil, political, and environmental rights within the city of Pittsburgh. Sometimes it's hard for our brains to get around it because we're used to seeing Bill of Rights as a state thing or as a federal thing. But this is cutting-edge stuff where municipalities are beginning to expand civil, political, and environmental rights out to provide another platform of rights that we generally have turned to the state or the federal government for. The fracking ban was implementing the Bill of Rights, because it said, okay, we have these rights here, what activities violate those rights, and one of which was fracking. So we're going to ban fracking as part of that Bill of Rights structure. And then the third part, to make it even more amazing, is they dismantled each of these doctrines. They said, if the state government issues permits that run afoul of our local Bill of Rights or our prohibitions which implement the Bill of Rights, that those permits are null and void within the city of Pittsburgh. Okay, so this does not work for the faint-hearted. This is structural, upfront, direct frontal challenge. Dillon's rule, they said we are a municipality, we have a right to local self-government, and therefore Dillon's rule doesn't apply here. On corporate constitutional rights, they declared that natural gas corporations operating in the city of Pittsburgh did not have the constitutional powers of persons within the municipality. So in other words, from these lessons that folks have learned over the last 15 years, the question is, how do you design an ordinance that becomes a, for lack of a better word, we don't use this phrase anymore, but a tar baby of sorts, knowing that the challenges are going to come in, how do you actually design the ordinance so that they directly challenge each of these doctrines as part of the structure and nullify them at the local level to put the municipality in the best defensible position, knowing that these are coming? She's asking what authority gives us the power in a municipality to pass it. And the authority is the people. And the authority is the New Hampshire Constitution, which we use in different places. The authority is the Declaration of Independence. The authority is other constitutional structures that say people are the source of all authority. There was a real battle in this country 100 years ago between whether municipalities had an inherent right to self-govern. It was called the Cooley Doctrine, versus Dillon's rule, where Dillon said it's not even necessary to elect the local officials that run your municipality because you're just an arm of the state. You're just carrying out the administrative wishes of the state, so there's no need to have elections because there's no requirement that those be elected officials. They can just be appointed by the state. That's Dillon's rule. And Dillon also said that municipalities are created, they're creatures of the state, you've probably all heard that phrase, and the state can abolish us if they see fit. So in other words, state has plenary authority over municipalities. Cooley and Dillon went head to head, and the U.S. Supreme Court picked Dillon as being the rule. So a lot of this is resuscitating some older stuff up and trying to drive it into law, but an understanding that local community self-government, that these doctrines run afoul of that. You can't have community self-government when a corporation can come in and use these doctrines to actually overturn what you have at the municipal level. But in the end, it's about us. It's who we think we are as a community. It's about whether we think we should be making the decisions or not. Because eventually, these court challenges, and there's going to be quite a few of them as this stuff moves forward, that eventually what the communities have to do is going to be to write new constitutional provisions or new legislative provisions that actually embed the right to local self-government into the constitutional structure.
So if a town is incorporated, then it's only incorporated with the permission of the state?
Correct. That's Dillon's rule. And Dillon also said that municipalities are created, they're creatures of the state, you've probably all heard that phrase, and the state can abolish us if they see fit. But in the end, it's about us. It's who we think we are as a community. It's about whether we think we should be making the decisions or not. Because eventually, these court challenges, and there's going to be quite a few of them as this stuff moves forward, that eventually what the communities have to do is going to be to write new constitutional provisions or new legislative provisions that actually embed the right to local self-government into the constitutional structure. Let's find a way to classify the project and then exempt out that classification. Because otherwise it's very easy for the corporate boys to come in and say, okay, well you've picked 4 of your pet projects or pet entities, and we want to stay away from that by classifying them.
The enforcement is up to your community.
In terms of the challenge that comes in, we not only draft and help draft the ordinances, but we also defend them. And so it depends on which court they're filed in, because state courts are much more difficult for us to deal with because we're not licensed in New Hampshire at this point. When we do work in states, we actually contract with local lawyers and then come in to use the model briefs, because we have model legal briefs for different things that have been set up. So we can either, and because it's the municipality that gets sued, the municipality has to decide which legal counsel it's going to use. They may choose their own, at which point we come in and we offer to give them legal briefs and to talk with their lawyers and do that kind of thing. If they choose us to defend them and it's filed in federal court where we can practice in New Hampshire, we just have to get admitted to federal court, we can provide a primary defense for that. If it's in state court, it becomes a little more sticky because they would have to have lead counsel of some kind representing the municipality, and then we would come in as secondary counsel, maybe what's called pro hac vici, which is for one time only. But we basically do anything we can to customize our help to what the municipality needs.
The likelihood of the municipality being challenged by one of these corporations that would have to say, we have more rights in
It's pretty high.
The likelihood is high.
Knowing what I know about this project, it's pretty high. I mean, there are other places that pass them. The corporation puts a factory farm in another place next door. In other words, they can do so. But this kind of project, it's kind of like the coal communities we work with, where the coal is under their ground and the corporation can't move around them. And so I would say it's probably pretty high possibility. It's a race to get as many places to pass something so that, for example, if one place gets sued, like is Sugar Hill. If Sugar Hill passes something and then gets sued, for the other communities to actually help them with the suit by coming in as a friend of the court. In Pennsylvania, we've had 13 other municipalities file as friend of the court in a case where one municipality was sued. Because everybody has something to lose at that point, because you're all moving the same structure forward.
Our New Hampshire Constitution actually predates the federal Constitution. And one thing that I would take further from one of your statements about the state quashing everything, there is one other level above the state, and it's not the feds. It's the people of the state of New Hampshire acting in a constitutional convention. And normally in New Hampshire, we have constitutional conventions every 10 years. We can have them every 10 years. We do have, as Representative Cooney mentioned, she is a representative here from Plymouth. We do have some other past state representatives in the room. I've also was a state rep for two years. One other thing that I think a lot of people don't fully know about our New Hampshire Constitution, that under our Bill of Rights, Part 1st of our Constitution, Article 10, which is entitled, and everybody's sitting down, Article 10 of our New Hampshire Constitution is entitled Right of Revolution. And if you don't mind me quoting this, government being instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of our whole community, and not for the private interest or emolument of any one man, family, or class of men. Therefore, whenever the ends of government are perverted and public liberty manifestly endangered, and all other means of redress are ineffectual, the people may, and of right, ought to reform the old or establish a new government. The doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. That's in our New Hampshire.
And you're the only constitution with that in it. None of the other state constitutions have that. Yeah.
But that's where the people can act and exert some control over their state government, is the people's doing it. We have a people's house where we have 400 representatives in our general court here in New Hampshire, and only 24 state senators. I think, Mary, you represent, what, 3,000? Well, I mean, you represent...
3,200.
Yeah, it's a small number. I mean, she represents more than that, but in terms of one person, one vote, the rep is whatever that number that Mary stated. Thank you, Mary.
And it's about framing the problem to get the right solution. And again, it's not for everybody. Some people, that I've dealt with are like, well, I'm going to sell my house and move. And a lot of people will choose to do that. They'll say, I don't need this fight. But for some people who understand that the battle is not just about Northern Pass, it's not about fracking, it's not about factory farms, it's not about sludging, it's not about water extraction. It's about the fact that we lack the authority to make decisions in our own community anymore.
Where does the fight go from there? Does it go to state court or does it go to federal court?
Well, just I'm going to roll that. The Attorney General does not have the power to stop you from adopting.
No, but he will rule on it. Yeah.
Which is okay.
Yeah.
Usually a legislator will turn to him and say, hey, is this constitutional or unconstitutional? And they'll do it prior to your town meeting to try to kill the town meeting, just to be clear.
Yeah.
That's when they do it. And so that has to be overridden first in people's heads to say, well, the Attorney General, he's acting for the state, and this thing is about getting rid of some state power in municipalities, so of course he's going to rule that way in reality. The state versus federal court thing is the choice of the corporation suing. They can drag you into federal court or they can remain in state court. They usually pull it out of state court because they don't want the state judges dealing with it because they may have a bias that favors you. So they want to pull it into a federal jurisdiction to get it as far away from the local as possible and have it heard in federal court. But what we would expect to happen is whenever you pass something at town meeting, that probably 3 months or so, they will come in and preemptively challenge the ordinance. And then the question becomes running through the court challenge in a way that uses the court challenge as the preeminent challenge in the state that draws other communities into doing something similar.
Quickly, strategically and tactically, these ordinances that are going to be discussed at our town meetings you are going to hear from the select board, the fathers, that they have talked with legal counsel, you know, and their legal counsel is gonna say, these are not going to be enforceable. They're not legal, they're not valid. And so, in my experience in going to town meetings over the last 50 years, I went even as a kid.
That wasn't that long ago. That wasn't that long ago.
You know, people, you know, a lot of our brothers and sisters, cousins and friends and co-workers, they give a lot of credence to what the town legal counsel says can and can't be done. And so, you know, I envision this, especially at Plymouth, and I don't know about Holderness, but I envision this especially in Plymouth, Mr. Selectman. And there'll be people that will get up and say, God help us if we go against town legal counsel. And so, you know, the only thing that I can say is, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead.
And the moderators are given broad powers in this state. The moderator really runs the meeting.
Right.
He may just say, I rule this is out of order, next article.
Well, that rarely happens, but what does happen sometimes is, or at least happened once, in my memory, is that the select board refused to put it on the warrant.
Even with a required number of signatures?
Yes, and so the people in the town, which town was it? Yeah, it was Maine.
That was in Shapley.
Shapley.
Shapley,
So the people in Shapley said, screw you, we're gonna do it anyway, and they held their own special town meeting.
Oh, yeah, simple majority.
Yeah. There will be all kinds of people that come out, as they have in Pennsylvania, to say that you shouldn't be doing what you know needs to be done, and that you're just silly little country people who should go back home and let them take care of the real business.
The selectmen also take an oath to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the residents.
We are getting so much apathy in this country that we go to a town meeting here in town of Plymouth with 5,000, 4,000, 3,000, 900 something voters, and there are 100 people that maybe. And what has been your experience and the best way to overcome that apathy, to get out the peoples? Because as soon as the most contentious thing gets done with, everybody gets up and leave, and now there's 20 people there, and the selectmen will put these kind of warrant articles on the very end.
Yeah, your
People
experience
left.
Your experience is not unlike that in other communities we've worked with in about 10 different states. The key is people have to be aware that it's not about the specific single issue that's coming up. They have to be aware that it's about broader stuff. I've kind of gotten beyond that. I mean, I'm happy that there's 20 people there now. Because I've been in meetings where there are 3. And most of the local government meetings I've been in where there's no contentious issue, it's the reporter for the local paper and maybe one other crazy guy who shows up and says,
Oh, that's
it's illegitimate.
Well, we have a town meeting coming up in about 6 weeks, and we want to get this ordinance passed. Every individual realizes the responsibility for yourself. Let it always be somebody else.
Yeah.
I think that's a big issue for people to realize, it's about responsibility.
That kind of stuff.
It's for future generations.
So I'm really concerned about the questions as you are about being sued, because our little town doesn't have very much money.
That gives the power to the town to actually file an action against someone else to stop them from doing X. And so when we say equity, that just means a court where you're asking for relief to get the person to stop doing X, or in this case, the corporation. So that's not about the town getting sued, that's actually about the town suing someone to enforce compliance with the ordinance.
Okay.
Because let's say the company ignores it.
Oh, I
They
see.
ignore the ordinance and they continue doing X, you want to have a provision where the town can actually enforce it.
From Spokane, Washington to Plymouth, New Hampshire to help out the people here. Thank you very much. Let's shake on that. Thank you from me.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, and it's been a pleasure to be here and traveling up and down New Hampshire and trying to provide whatever help we can to the folks working on the Northern Pass stuff.
So where did you spend the night?
The Centennial Inn down in Concord, which is one of our favorite places to stay, and works out well because it's mid-state, so there we have access to all the different places we need to go.
Well, that's very nice. You know, the people in New Hampshire are concerned about Northern Pass and about projects similar. or in the future, coming this way and threatening landowner rights and threatening any way of life here. So it's great that you came to help. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, until we do something to actually change the structure to give ourselves governing authority in our own communities, chances are projects like Northern Pass, it's not the last one to come through, there's going to be more. And so the idea is how do we make structural change to actually give our communities decision-making authority so we don't have to do this every time something comes through that we don't want.
So Attorney Linzey, it's not as simple as taking a piece of paper and filing it as an ordinance, is it?
No, it's actually the first step of a series of steps that leads to some kind of constitutional change to recognize the right of the community to make decisions in the name of sustainability, to make sure that things like Northern Pass don't come in.
Well, thank you for taking time away from your private life to spend this afternoon with us.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jones.
Bye-bye.